This is Intro to Africa. I'm Dr. Young. This is the second part of the introductory section of the course where we're looking at some basic concepts that will help us understand Africa, some of the basics of African societies, African civilization. I want to turn our attention now to the geography of Africa. And this is tremendously important for understanding how human beings lived in Africa. It's really essential for even beginning an exploration of the history. We have to understand the geography of the continent. First of all, it's necessary to comprehend that Africa is gigantic. Often this is misunderstood, partly because it was obfuscated in the past. European map makers tended to misrepresent the size of Africa on maps, making it roughly the same size as Europe. This led to the kind of misperception that Africa was not that big or important, and that Europe was, the dominant continent on Earth. And this was purposeful. So in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, Africa was literally sort of devalued or undersized purposefully by Europeans. In truth, all of the continental United States and China and Western Europe can fit inside of Africa with room to spare. Okay? That's how large this place is. It's the second largest continent on Earth. It is vastly larger than North America, vastly larger than Europe, certainly. And it is also growing in population. Historically, and we will talk about this more as we go on here, Africa has had a fairly small population, especially for the size of the continent. Underpopulation is one of the key themes of African history that we'll be exploring in this class. But that has changed, and the demographic trend has Africa growing faster than any other region of the world today. There are, roughly 1 billion people in Africa at this point in time, and that growth is going to continue exponentially unless something is done to arrest it. So the demographics are changing tremendously. Okay. Now, as far as geographic features go, Africa is not only huge, but it is also incredibly diverse. If you can follow, sort of my pointing here, up here on the coastline of the Mediterranean, Africa has a very temperate, in fact, Mediterranean climate is the name for it. This, produces moderate amounts of rainfall, a fairly temperate and moderate set of temperatures year-round, and really long growing seasons. Some of the best agricultural land in the world historically has been found in the Nile Valley of Egypt. This is one of the reasons why it's one of the, Egypt was home to one of the earliest civilizations in human history. As well as over here north of the Atlas Mountains in far northwest Africa, up here close to the Strait of Gibraltar, and then all along the coast of what is now Algeria and Morocco, and parts of Tunisia. I mean, this was historically a tremendously productive region for the growing of grain and other foodstuffs. In fact, the Roman Empire really would probably not have reached the heights that it did if the food supply from this part of Africa was not constantly being shipped over to Italy to supply the needs of the vast population of the city of Rome. Now, if you go south, and you'll notice, if you look at a map of modern Africa, of course, that, the country of Algeria, I believe it's the largest country geographically in Africa now that Sudan has been split into two. But Algeria enjoys this nice fertile coastline and then stretches into the Sahara Desert here, and the same thing goes for Libya and Egypt and some of these other places. And this is a historic division. I mean, the peoples of the coast did not mix much with the peoples of the interior here. Bedouin, or rather not Bedouin, Berber is the name. Berber nomads who inhabited the interior here. Now, I should clarify that term, by the way. We're going to talk about different ways that people have eked out an existence from the land. We're going to talk about hunter-gatherers, certainly, in this class, especially in the first part of it. We will also talk about the rise of agriculture. But accompanying agriculture, of course, was the domestication of animals. And some societies ended up relying almost entirely on domesticated animals and following, or rather herding their animals from one place of forage or one place of pasturage to another, and from one watering hole to another. A nomad is not a hunter-gatherer. Technically speaking, a nomad is a pastoralist. And so when I talk about nomadic peoples, I'm not just talking about peoples who wander. In fact, that is sort of beside the point, or that's just an attendant circumstance. Nomads are pastoralists. And there are a lot of nomads in Africa, or rather historically there have been a lot of nomads. That is, people who have relied primarily on their animals for their economy, for their sustenance, and as a consequence have been more apt to move around than to stay in one place. Not for the same reason that hunter-gatherers move around. Hunter-gatherers are chasing wild animals and looking for wild plants, things that grow naturally, rather than relying on things that are stable. And some of these, some parts of Africa have mixed economies historically, but that's all important to understand. Now, the only people who can inhabit the Sahara region historically were nomads. Nomads whose primary animal was the camel, though they probably also had sheep and goats. These are different from the nomads of sub-Saharan Africa. There are lots of nomads, especially down here, kind of east of the Great Lakes region and down into this region on the outskirts of the Kalahari Desert, west of the Drakensberg Mountains here, into the Cape region of South Africa, as well as kind of in the areas to the north and east of the Kalahari Desert. These places have also been home to a lot of nomadic peoples, pastoralists, and in this case, their animal was the cattle, rather than the camel. Okay, so we have camel nomads up here in the Sahara, and then we have cattle nomads down here in East Africa and down in Southern Africa. Anyway, back to the geography. South of the Mediterranean region here, we have the largest desert in the world. It's not the driest desert in the world. There actually are some regions of the Sahara that are home to oases, and historically the Sahara was not always as dry as it is now. And we'll talk about that when we discuss really ancient history and the first human societies in Africa. In a course that's coming, or in a lecture that's coming up very soon. South of the Sahara is this region that runs all the way across the continent here, called the Sahel, Sahel. And this is a tremendously important region historically, partly because, at least over here, there is a really important river, the Niger River, with the Volta and Benue, which also kind of interact with it. But the upper bend of the Niger runs right through the Sahel, and along the Niger there were a lot of really important settlements, even cities, that served as a kind of basis for empires that existed in West Africa historically. So the Sahel region, which is steppe or grassland, quite arid, especially as it gets closer to the Sahara, but enough rainfall historically to grow some food and to serve as an important agricultural region, right? And it stretches all the way over here into what is now Sudan, and these places have been home to large-scale civilizations since ancient times. South of that, we have a vast region of rainforest. Okay, this gets particularly dense down here in the Congo River basin. The Congo River is not the longest river in Africa. That, of course, is the Nile, which comes from, well, there are two parts of the Nile. And actually, I've got another slide here about the rivers, so I will talk about that more when we look at that. But the Congo River runs through this rainforest and is fed by the rainforest. This is really dense rainforest region here. Not easy to do agriculture in this region. People have relied on forest products primarily for their sustenance living here. Vine crops. Some peoples have been hunter-gatherers historically in this region, though there have been people who have mixed that with some domestication of plants and animals there as well. A really important region historically is the area bordering the rainforest, which has been a site of a lot of migration. People sort of, moved along the edge of the rainforest down here into the Great Lakes region of Africa, and then, around the southern side of the rainforest here. All part of a long and important movement of peoples that we will talk about again in a future course here, a future lecture. Now, there's also rainforest over here along the coast of West Africa, the southern coast of West Africa, though it is not as dense as the Congo area. And there's been a lot of interaction historically between the peoples of this area who have not tended to form large-scale societies, empires, or kingdoms, but rather have formed smaller-scale societies. That's simply what worked for them. Even what we might call city-states almost, or in some cases non-hegemonic microstates. And I'll explain what all of that means later on. But there's been a lot of trade between the peoples of the forest here and the peoples of the Sahel. In fact, the trade is extended all the way across the Sahara historically, as the Berber nomads learned how to traverse this vast desert, learned where the oases were and places to go to, shelter from dust storms. There's a whole lore to this. It's very similar in its own way to sailors historically learning to cross vast bodies of water, because it involves similar kinds of techniques. You have to know sort of the signs of weather. You need to be able to navigate by the stars, and quite a number of other things. But there's been a tremendous amount of trade across the Sahara, and that trade extends all the way down here into the forest region. Products from here were traded into the Sahel, and then were traded via Berber nomads across the desert here to the Mediterranean region. So economically, all of these regions are connected in some way. Now, East Africa, or rather the Horn of Africa region here, is home to a very dry desert. But then there are mountains up here called the Ethiopian Highlands. And this region has been really important historically, has been kind of its own, a unique civilization formed in Ethiopia, and it's one of the most important places. One of the most long-standing settled regions of Africa, going all the way back to the ancient world. So we'll have plenty to say about Ethiopia as time goes on with this course. Now, one of the most unique geographic features of Africa is a vast valley here called the Great Rift Valley. This is formed by plate tectonics, where sort of things came together. Also, actually, by some glacier activity, I believe, in this area during the last ice age. But anyway, this forms the Great Lakes. The largest of these there are three of them. I mean, there are more than that. You've got Lake Albert and some of these others, and Lake Kivu here. Okay, but this one is called Lake Victoria. It has not been called that historically. It was only named that by British explorers in the 19th century, of course, after Queen Victoria. There is also a Lake Albert named after her husband, the Prince Consort of England in the 19th century. Down here we have Lake Tanganyika. And then finally down here, Lake Malawi or Lake Nyasa. There are two different names for that, right? Lots of rainfall in this region, but also rich for agriculture, especially the growing of grain and also the cultivation of bananas. And one might wonder, how why bananas could be so important, but actually there were whole societies that were sustained by banana agriculture. And we'll talk about that later again. And so the Great Lakes region has been able to sustain a higher population density than just about any other region of Africa, apart from Egypt and kind of the Mediterranean area. So the Great Lakes, really, really important place, and we'll have plenty to say about this as well. Down here east of the Great Lakes, there is a vast plain known as the Serengeti. Again, kind of a Sahelian grassland steppe region, or rather savanna region. That's really the name for it. And, also rich for grain agriculture. Now, and then finally down here we have, another desert, the Kalahari Desert. And then another kind of Mediterranean climate down here, right along the southern coast of Africa in the Cape of Good Hope region. And we haven't even spoken about Madagascar, which is its own thing. And it is almost as diverse. It's kind of a microcosm of the rest of Africa. You have a rainforest there. You also have some very dry regions in Madagascar. This course will really not talk much about Madagascar because historically it has been a region somewhat apart from the continent here, settled, by people from the Middle East, actually, and unique flora and fauna and things like that. And a lot of people know about Madagascar because of the animated films. This is one of the areas, for some reason, that people can identify geographically on a map. It's really kind of incredible that that's the case. So what we have here is a kind of, well, the geography proceeds in one order and then it goes in the reverse order. So we have Mediterranean, desert, savanna, rainforest, and then in reverse, savanna, desert, Mediterranean. Okay, and so it comes down here into the rainforest and then goes back in reverse order as we go further and further south in Africa. Some other features, and I've talked about some of these already, but just to show you a kind of different map. The whole of the southern part of Africa is on a vast plateau here. It's actually quite high above sea level. This culminates in the Drakensberg Mountains here in South Africa and also stretches up here. The Great Rift Valley is actually quite high, but two plates come together here and form this rift, stretching all the way down here to one of the most interesting geographic features in the whole world, as Victoria Falls down here. It's a spectacular instance where these two plates come together. But then these plates also sort of push up, so we have the Ethiopian highlands, and then the fairly high region here in East Africa, descending out to the Serengeti Plain here. And so, this also affects the rivers. Now, the rest of Africa over here is close to sea level or not much above it, though we do have the various mountain ranges, the Atlas and the Ahagar and others kind of here in the Sahara region or between the Sahara and the Mediterranean. Here are the rivers. And, if we look back at this map of the mountains, you'll see that there's this high plateau and the Great Rift Valley up here, which is really quite high. The Congo River has its origins and its various tributaries here in the highlands region, and it flows rather precipitously. There are often huge drops of elevation along the course of the Congo River. This is one of the most interesting rivers in the world, in fact. And so the river is not only, and then it's fed by the rainforest. So we not only have these huge drops in elevation, but we also have massive amounts of rainfall feeding this river. The Congo River, of all the rivers in the world, has the second highest volume of water, even though the Nile River, is, I think, more than twice as long as the Congo River, about twice as long as the Congo River. The Congo River has a lot higher volume of water. The only one that it's surpassed by, of course, is the Amazon, which is also fed by a massive rainforest, right? So the Congo and the Amazon are actually quite similar, and the regions here are similar in a lot of ways. Other important rivers, the Niger I mentioned over here, starts kind of in the rainforest region here on the coast, moves up to the north through the Sahel region, through the savanna region here, and then back down into the rainforest, where it comes together with the Benue River and forms a delta over here that flows into the Atlantic. This is this delta region, especially in modern times, is really important because there are huge oil deposits there. South of the Sahara, south of the Niger, I should say, we have the Volta River, which also flows into the Atlantic with 3 different sources. Of course, the Nile, maybe the most famous river in the world, certainly in Africa. There are 2 parts to the Nile until it comes together around the city of Khartoum in what is now Sudan. One, the White Nile, which is the western part of the Nile, or the western branch of the Nile, I should say, starts in Lake Victoria and flows north. Then the other part here, the Blue Nile, it's called, the eastern branch, starts in the Ethiopian highlands. Now, the Nile is interesting. It's one of the most unique rivers in the world because it is so calm and predictable. There's very little surprise in the Nile. The same thing happens every year. The monsoon rains that affect the Indian Ocean, if we were to extend the map out here, of course, we'd have the Indian Ocean. The monsoon rains that affect the Indian Ocean do hit East Africa here, causing yearly, almost exactly the same time every year, a flood that goes up the Nile, or rather down the Nile, up meaning north, but it's downstream from both the Blue and White Nile here, causing the Nile, once it reaches the lower Nile Valley, the place that has been inhabited for the longest time, again, the site of one of the earliest civilizations in human history, it causes the Nile to overflow its banks. The Nile has some natural levees, but yearly it overflows and brings all of this nice soil. The Great Rift Valley, because it's formed by these plate tectonics, it reaches deep into the crust of the earth, throwing up soil that is incredibly rich for agriculture. This, again, is one of the reasons why the Great Lakes region is able to sustain a much higher population, because the soil is just so productive. But some of that soil ends up in the Nile flood, coming down here, overflowing the banks, and supplying this really rich agriculture for the lower Nile Valley. All right. South of the Congo, beginning also kind of in the rainforest, is the Zambezi River. Again, drops precipitously in places. Some of the best rapids in the world are along the Zambezi. If you really like whitewater rafting, this is kind of a dream destination. The Congo is almost unnavigable, but the Zambezi is more navigable than that. And it's fed from a kind of a tributary that starts in Lake Nyasa or Lake Malawi here as well. And then finally down here in the south, there's a river missing, the Limpopo River, which is along the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe. And then over here, the Orange River, which flows out of the Drakensberg Mountains and moves west through the Namib Desert here into the Atlantic. Rainfall, and this is all connected, of course, to the rivers and the geography and everything. You can see that there are vast amounts of rainfall over here in what is now Cameroon, right? Right in the heart of the rainforest. Over 3,000 millimeters, 300 centimeters a year, right? And the same thing over here in the rainforest region in West Africa, what is now Sierra Leone and Liberia. But lots of rainfall all through the rainforest region. A couple of important points, right? Once the rainfall gets below 400 millimeters, 40 centimeters a year, farming becomes very difficult, almost impossible, you might say. And so there is this line, okay, right around there, so all through the Sahel here, where south of that line, agriculture is possible. People can grow various foodstuffs. This would, in West Africa, this would have been things like, well, in the rainforest region, yams, but maybe some grain crops and things up here. You know, down here, down through this region, there's enough rainfall to grow grain and other things. But then here south of the rainforest, again, that 400-meter line runs right there. Now, the zone here, which is between 200 and 400 millimeters, and here, okay, same thing, these are areas where it's possible to pasture animals, but not to grow grain, not to grow any kind of foodstuffs. Really, agriculture is not very possible there. And so these have historically been regions dominated by pastoralists. Now, in regions where there's, say, between 400 and 600, like over here, or here, or here, there has been a mixed economy, often some contention between the agriculturalists and the pastoralists, and often setting up a hierarchy where the pastoralists, because they are more mobile and thus more warlike, were able to subject the agriculturalists to their rule, and this has created some historic tensions. Okay, pastoralism does not mean lack of virility, or lack of strength, lack of power. In fact, pastoralists historically have been really quite successful at putting together kingdoms and empires and things like this. So, that's one of the things that we'll discuss, one of the trends that we'll try to spend some time with. Now, a few more key concepts before we begin our discussion of, African history and start to follow the chronology. Sorry, I have to yawn for a second here. Okay. One of the things that you might note, this map shows the population densities, and this is kind of more recent, but we can see the areas that have sustained a higher population. I mentioned that the Great Lakes region was able to sustain a really high population, right? This area right around Lake Victoria, what is now Rwanda and Burundi, and parts of Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania. Very high population density, relatively speaking. Same with the Ethiopian highlands here. Okay, and part of that is the stability of the kingdom that was established there. And then down here, right along the Niger River. I mean, the river is not displayed here, but you can see all of this brown really follows the course of the Niger. And then, up here in the Mediterranean region, like I said, the agricultural region up here, and then in the lower Nile Valley, right? Those have been the most densely populated areas. The rest of that, outside of those regions, the areas, the other geography of Africa constitutes a frontier. There has been a tremendous amount of movement of peoples in African history, a constant frontier. Okay? This frontier was not like the frontier of America, where, in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, people moved gradually westward. The first European settlements were along the east coast, of course, and there was, apart from the settlements in now Mexico and even parts of New Mexico, but this gradual movement to the west, where there was a defined kind of line of the frontier that kept moving further and further west. The same thing went for Europe in the Middle Ages, by the way, where there was this frontier on the east, where peoples from Western Europe moved gradually over time, and the frontier line continued to move. In Africa, the frontier is different. There's not necessarily one defined line, okay? And neither was there a migration of people so spectacular as there was in, the Wild West in the United States, or even in, the the high and late Middle Ages in Europe, where people would move, sort of hundreds of miles at a time to go and stake claims to land. The movement into the frontier has been gradual, very gradual in African history. Movement just maybe a few hundred yards at a time, a few kilometers or miles at a time, right? Because there's always been historically a frontier, a virgin land that has not been worked because the population density was so low in most of Africa. Underpopulation, again, is one of the major themes of African history. Okay, and so we're going to be talking about population history, right? The impact that population, in most cases underpopulation, has had on Africa, though in recent times we will have to talk about overpopulation in some parts of Africa as well. Africa has been characterized by mobile agriculture. After agriculture was developed in Africa, and in fact, in Egypt, this is one of the earliest regions in the world to develop agriculture, probably just after Western Asia here, the region called Mesopotamia or the Fertile Crescent, likely was the first to develop agriculture, but Egypt, may have developed it independently just after that. And there probably was some spreading of agricultural knowledge up the Nile River, up meaning south again. But agriculture has moved with the population, right? From at least, in sub-Saharan Africa here, from at least the late second millennium BCE or so. People have moved, and they have moved, again, just piecemeal. They work the land until the nutrients are exhausted and the land ceases to be productive, and then they pick up everything they have and they move a short distance, a few miles, until they, come upon land that has not been worked, and they start a new settlement there, right? And then, a few years after that, they have to do the same thing. Typical, sub-Saharan African agriculturalist in the pre-modern era, really before say the 19th century or so, was likely to move probably several times over the course of a single lifetime. But the moves were not great and spectacular. They were just a few miles at a time, probably. What this means for agricultural civilization in Africa is that it did not develop a lot of permanent structures or permanent institutions. People built settlements or dwellings that could be moved easily. That were not built necessarily of durable materials meant to endure for several generations. They used simple building materials that could be dismantled easily and that could be found easily. Their only property that they held for long periods of time that they would pass down would be things like agricultural implements. Their digging tools, their agricultural hoes or shovels or something like that, as well as cooking utensils and things they could pack up easily in a single bundle and carry with them a few miles until they reached a point where they could form a new settlement. Right, that is one of the definitive features of African history. Okay, now because Africa was so underpopulated, and this goes for just about all of Africa, except again for say the lower Nile Valley, or perhaps the Mediterranean region up here. So pretty much everything south of that, okay, was underpopulated until very recent times, and people could move very easily, right? Thus, land had little value. People did not locate their wealth in land. Land was abundant. Everybody had access to plenty of land, right? Rather, wealth was contained in durable things, more durable things. In pastoralist societies, wealth was contained entirely in their animals, right? The person who had the largest herd of cattle or the largest number of camels was the wealthiest in those societies, right? And in agricultural areas, land simply, I mean, even though land was obviously very important, that was not the source of wealth or the source of prestige. Thus, political power had nothing to do in sub-Saharan Africa or in most of Africa with control of land, right? One of the kind of analogies I like to use here is African leaders were not like Yertle the turtle from Dr. Seuss's book, right, where he looks out over all of the land that he can see and says, "I am the king of all I see," right? Meaning the land that surrounds. Okay, a king, a ruler, a system of elders, whatever the political system was in an African society, had again nothing to do with control of land. It had everything to do with control of people. Power over people is the central feature of African political history. Now, the question here arises, and I love to have discussions with students about this: how does one gain power over people? Well, the short and most basic answer to that is they have to provide incentives for people to remain part of a system, to remain connected to the person exercising political power. What kind of incentives? Well, an incentive might be coercion. I have the largest number of warriors under my command, and if you try to do anything that I don't want you to do, like move away, for instance, I will use my warriors to force you to remain in place or to enslave you or whatever it is, right? And in fact, enslavement, of course, is a key feature of African politics for much of its history. We're going to talk a lot about slavery in Africa, and especially the transatlantic slave trade later on in the course. But they have to provide incentives. Those incentives, again, might be coercion, or they might not be coercive. There might be other kinds of incentives, like we are linked together by kinship. And so you need to remain here with this same people because we have a relationship that is backed up perhaps by stories we tell about our ancestors, a folklore, right? There might be institutions that keep people in the same place. Later in the course, we will talk about title systems in many parts of Africa, where people would work to obtain titles and prestige and honor in their societies, or they may have market institutions that work for them, that keep them together as a people, that even if they move from one region to another, they maintain those institutions, right? So incentives to keep people connected to each other and part of the same political system. This is often difficult for Westerners to wrap their minds around, because politics, political power is so different in Africa than it is in other parts of the world, or the parts that we're more familiar with. All right, if there are questions about that, if this is not crystal clear at this point, please address this in the discussion board. This is absolutely key. We have to comprehend what this means in order to understand much of African history. Environmental history. Africans were subject to their environment. And because Africa was so underpopulated, perhaps even more so than in other regions of the world. They simply had to adapt to their environment in order to survive. They could not, apply simple manpower or human power, with a vast population to tame the land and to sort of defy the elements. Africans had to be subject to those elements. Another key concept is the relationship with the Eurasian Old World. We're talking here about Europe and Western Asia, the part of the world that had the earliest civilizations. Africa had a relationship historically with the Eurasian Old World. This was especially the case for areas like Egypt, which in so many ways was far more connected to the Fertile Crescent and the Eastern Mediterranean, even the Greek lands here, than it was to the rest of Africa. Afrocentric attempts to link up Egypt with the rest of Africa notwithstanding, I don't think that those are accurate, and I think I discussed those in the last lecture just briefly. But Egypt has certainly been more connected to the other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean than it has to the areas across the Sahara here. There are some exceptions to that, and there certainly is Egyptian influence, as we'll see down here into the Horn of Africa region, and we'll talk about that later. Same thing for the kind of Western Mediterranean here. These lands over here, what is now Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, the area around the Strait of Gibraltar. These have had an intimate connection with the other, the lands on the north shore of the Mediterranean. These were all part, for instance, of the Roman Empire anciently. And key parts. They weren't peripheral. They were key parts. This was Egypt and North Africa were the key agricultural areas, as I've said, right? So a very close connection historically between these areas of Africa and the Eurasian Old World. But because there was contact via the trans-Saharan trade routes and the Nile River trade routes between these Mediterranean regions and sub-Saharan Africa, certain things did spread down here. For instance, disease. The African continent was home to many of the same diseases that afflicted the Eurasian Old World, which meant that when the contact between those areas and sub-Saharan Africa increased in the modern era, in the early modern era, I should say, starting in the 15th century or so, with Portuguese navigation and other things. The same period, the voyages of exploration period, contact between sub-Saharan Africa and Europe increases tremendously during that time. Well, they didn't have the same problem, for instance, that the Native Americans did, where the Europeans brought smallpox and other diseases to the Americas, which absolutely wiped out those populations. They had not been exposed to these things before. Their immune systems simply could not handle this. And over the course of a couple of centuries, probably 80 to 90% of all native inhabitants of America died, thus allowing the Europeans to exploit the land at a much higher rate than they probably would have been able to had the Native Americans not been killed off in such vastly huge numbers, right? Africans, although, their immune exposure, as it were, was not as great maybe to some of these diseases, and there were outbreaks of these things, it didn't decimate their population like it did with the Native Americans. And there are other things that we could talk. Other goods that we could talk about. The other thing that I haven't mentioned here, in this slide at least, is the relationship that East Africa had historically with the Indian Ocean, that stretching all the way over to India and Indonesia and Southeast Asia, and even to some extent East Asia, China and Japan. There was trade contact, right? And a lot of interaction between the peoples of East Africa and those regions. And so Africa historically, although its geography does cut it off, especially the Sahara, does cut it off from Eurasia to a great extent, there has been historical contact, right? Enough that it's more of a trickle than a steady flow, but enough of a trickle that, you know, that Africa was able to benefit to some extent from that. Okay. Now, a final couple of points here, right? We often, I think, view African history as one long struggle. Humans against nature, against a very foreboding nature, right? And this is certainly the case. One of the things I haven't discussed that I probably should have in this lecture is disease. Disease in Africa has been a real problem. The mosquito-borne diseases of the rainforest region, especially malaria, has probably, taken a human toll almost greater than any other. I mean, historically, than any other disease in the world, in world history. The people in Africa have tended to die of malaria in shockingly high percentages, right? And the other disease that I would mention is trypanosomiasis, or otherwise known as African sleeping sickness. This is also a disease of the rainforest region. And what this means is that, this does afflict human beings, but even more so, it afflicts large fauna, large animals. And so, this whole area from over here in the Senegambia region, through kind of the southern skirt of the Sahel, down here all through the Congo Basin, right, and even some of the Great Lakes to some extent. This region has not been able to sustain any large animals. Cattle and horses and camels and other things simply could not live here because of African sleeping sickness. This is spread by a little insect found in Africa called the tsetse fly. The bite of the tsetse fly will, an infected tsetse fly will spread to a large animal, it causes them to experience tremendous lethargy to the point where they can't even feed themselves or get water, and they die as an attendant result of that, right? And so this obviously informs, the life of people in these regions tremendously. Now, so we might see African history as a result of disease and human disasters like the transatlantic slave trade and other things as one long course of suffering. The thing that we don't maybe comprehend, though, is that Africans, while in their folklore there is discussion of suffering, people encountering problems, just as there is in the literatures of every people of the world who have produced literature, which means just about everybody, right? Whether it's oral or written. There are also other values, right, or other emphases, other themes, and suffering is not necessarily the dominant theme from the Afrocentric point of view. Okay. Courage and creativity and innovation, right? All of these things are prized by African societies and emphasized in their own version, their kind of self-definition, just as much as suffering is, or maybe more than suffering is. Okay. And so, from a Western viewpoint, we look at Africa perhaps and say, oh, people have suffered so much in Africa. And from a kind of objective viewpoint, that probably is true. But on the other hand, Africans didn't necessarily see their lives as defined by suffering. Yes, they had their challenges, just as all peoples have challenges. Those challenges were unique to some extent to Africa, given the geographic situation and diseases and climate and other things that posed serious challenges. But they did overcome these challenges, and their society, formed societies that thrived. They had their own ways of living. And just because again they're not Western does not mean that their way of life is not valid. And this is one of the ways that certainly Eurocentric historians have erred in thinking that Africans are all just benighted, ignorant, and dark peoples whose lives have been defined by suffering. Right? African values are different, and we must take those values into account as we explore African history. Now, I know that these two lectures have gone on for some time, and we really haven't even gotten to the chronology yet at all. But hopefully at this point you are equipped with the tools necessary to understand this. There has to be a remedial element to this course because most students come to this with little or no exposure to African history. So any other questions you may have, please address them on the discussion board. I would be happy to help you out with anything. Hopefully you're able to glean a lot from your reading assignments and things as well, and you can begin to make sense of all of this. And hopefully, your exploration of African history will be delightful and be revealing and interesting to you. I should say one thing kind of in conclusion here, and I probably should have said this up front, but I am not an unbiased observer of Africa. I have a stake in Africa. I lived there. It's kind of a second home to me. I often say that I left my heart in Africa, and this is an important place to me, and I want to be an advocate for this continent. And so you will hear me probably at times become somewhat passionate about kind of explaining the plight of Africans, explaining the viewpoint of Africans, to try to bring some, to help students have empathy for the peoples of this continent, to understand that there are, a lot of different ways of thinking about the world, and the Western notions are not always necessarily the most productive or important. So all of that said, in the next lecture we'll begin to delve into the chronology of African history.